I've tried a ton of Grooveboxes and standalone music production devices, so today I want to answer a question I get pretty often. What would I recommend for a beginner? Either a beginner to music production in general or a beginner to Grooveboxes looking to get into a more hardware experience. This will lean very heavily on my own experiences and what I have and haven't had a chance to try, but I did get some very helpful input from my audience of Groovebox nerds to make sure that these recommendations make sense and get some ideas from them. And while I will be recommending some budget options, I'm not just going to recommend budget options. Because this video is about Grooveboxes, I'm of course going to put a very heavy emphasis on hardware devices, but if you are really on a budget and are still trying to figure out if this whole Groovebox thing is even for you, I and some of my viewers recommend that you start out by trying some sort of music production app like Koala Sampler. Koala is great because it's quite intuitive and it works on both Android and iOS. It's pretty cheap, so it's got a nice low barrier of entry, and it will let you at least get a feel for what this whole Groovebox experience might be like. And if you like that, maybe that's a cue to give hardware a try. Or maybe you like it enough to just stick with that, or you decide this whole Groovebox thing is not for you, which is totally fine as well. By the way, I've done dedicated videos covering each option I'm going to talk about, including Koala Sampler, so I'll link a big playlist at the end of this video. If you've decided you want to take the plunge and go in on a hardware device, this is my and my viewers' #1 recommendation: the Novation Circuit Tracks. This applies whether you're a complete beginner to music production or a beginner to Grooveboxes. That's because the user interface and the user experience of the circuit tracks, at least according to myself and most people I've gotten feedback from, is super intuitive. That's partially because of really good user interface design and partially because it is a bit more limited, but not so limited that you can't get good sounding stuff out of it. It doesn't have a screen, but that actually makes it more hands-on and fun to use in my opinion. And I've gotten feedback from blind and sight-impaired users that it's one of their go-tos. And in addition to all that, the Circuit Tracks is a fairly budget-friendly device with options to expand to a bigger setup if you want to do that down the road. So here's the circuit by itself. And here's the circuit tracks with a couple of budget hardware synths. If you're even more constrained as far as budget goes, the original Novation circuit, dubbed the Circuit OG after it was discontinued, might also be worth a look. It too is super intuitive and goes, at least at the time of filming, for around $200. That of course could change going forward, but that's where we're at in mid to early 2023. It's basically the old version of the Circuit Tracks with a very similar workflow and the same sound engine. There are some important limitations to both the Circuit Tracks and the OG that you do need to be aware of. For one thing, they have just 2 synth tracks and 4 drum tracks, that's it, and not everyone loves how the synth engine sounds. Also, you can load in your own samples into the drum tracks, but you can't play them out across a keyboard, and you can't record audio in. The Circuit Rhythm, however, fills in some of these limitations while introducing more of its own. It has more built-in tracks, all of which are sample based, meaning that it can kind of sound like whatever you want it to, but you can only play one note at a time on each track, although you can switch between multiple sounds over the course of one track. It does have some pretty good sample chopping if you want to go the hip-hop production route, although do note that the total sample time per pack, 222 seconds, does get eaten up pretty quickly, so your mileage for actually having material to chop at your fingertips may vary. It's also worth noting that none of the circuits have any direct way to export audio, so you'll have to basically record the output and perform a song by launching patterns live, kind of in a way that a DJ like Skrillex or Deadmau5 would use a launch pad live. This can actually be a really fun way to work for that reason, and there are some budget-friendly options for recording your circuit. That'll be in one of the videos in the playlist that I link at the end of this video, but it's definitely good to know going in. If you want to break away from some of these limitations and gain quite a few extra features and don't mind putting up with a bit more of a clunky workflow, the Roland MC-101 might be a good option to look into. The MC-101 is another budget-friendly option with 4 tracks, a cleaner sounding synth engine with full access to editing its parameters directly on the unit itself, the ability to basically turn samples into synths, multi-track recording over USB, and a comically tiny screen. It's got a reputation for being clunky and a bit unintuitive to work with, but once you get some of the key shortcuts and muscle memory pathways down, it's actually quite pleasant and even fast. It's one of the earlier Grooveboxes I got, and once I got over the initial hump, I found myself really taking to it. I think you can actually make it intuitive once you get used to it. Regardless, here's what it can sound like. The devices I've shown you so far are battery powered and extremely portable. These next few aren't. It's actually a family of devices, not all of which fit the strict Groovebox definition, and that is the Native Instruments machines. 2 of the current lineup are MIDI controllers, so they have to be connected to a computer for them to work, and they are meant to control the software that was built to work hand in hand with them. The other is a completely standalone that I'll talk about in a second. But in terms of the controllers, the most budget-friendly one is the Maschine Micro, which I think is a great entry point into more hands-on music production. Now, you will find yourself having to go like back and forth from the controller to your computer a bit, but it's reasonably tactile to work with and pretty competitive in terms of the price. If you've got a decent computer that can run a DAW and some plugins with low latency, the Maschine Micro is a great entry point into a Groovebox-esque form of production that's more hands-on and a bit live performance-y. Its big sibling, the Maschine Mark III, is meant to be such a complete hands-on experience that you never have to look at your computer screen if you don't want to. It more or less lives up to it, and I would still comfortably recommend either of these controllers to beginners. The Maschine Plus, like I alluded to earlier, is the one that would probably be considered a true Groovebox, because unlike the other machines, it is completely standalone. It can work by itself without needing to connect to a computer because it is a little computer. This can be super appealing if you truly want something all in one. Although the important caveats with that are its processing power is relatively limited, and it can't just run any plugin like the Maschine computer equivalents can. It can only run plugins that are inside of Native Instruments' walled garden. But if you are a beginner who wants some serious power and has some serious cash to burn, the Maschine Plus is worth a look. It's definitely got a steeper learning curve than some of the budget devices that I've mentioned, but in my case, the Maschine Plus was my first expensive Groovebox-like device, but I got over that learning curve pretty quickly and had a lot of fun using it. It's reasonably well designed and intuitive. So I would probably recommend any of the Maschine devices to a complete beginner, but if you are an intermediate producer looking to get into hardware, the MPC One might also be worth a look. It's a bit more intimidating to get into, and the user interface features more jank, so I would not necessarily recommend this to a complete beginner, but I would probably recommend it to someone looking to get into hardware, as long as you know what you're getting into. For what it's worth, I've used mine heavily over the past year and a half, and I absolutely love it, in spite of all the times that I have been completely frustrated with it. At this point, you've gotten my top recommendations, but I want to go through some honorable mentions and a couple of little warnings of stuff to avoid. If you've got it like that financially and have a bit of production under your belt and want a maybe more old school but still very clean and polished experience, it might be worth checking out the Roland MC-101, the big sibling of the MC-101. Or if you're on a budget and don't mind getting something that feels and sounds just a little bit more dated, the Korg Electribe 2 is well worth a look. It's portable, reasonably intuitive, surprisingly feature-packed, and has pretty good onboard sound shaping possibilities and multi-track export. I'd happily recommend the synth version to a beginner. I've heard that the sample version is good too, but I haven't had a chance to try that yet. Now, I did get some audience feedback about Electron devices, things like the Digitact or Model Samples. I haven't had a chance to try the Model Samples, but for the Digitact, I would recommend that to maybe someone who's got some background with music production already and is a bit more old school. I think old school producers tend to love the Digitact, and maybe younger ones might prefer some of this other stuff that I've already talked about. I do have one firm anti-recommendation though, because this device is actually quite intuitive, but I can't justify recommending it, and that's the OP1, either the original or the Field. I got an OP1 way back in the day when it was about $800, and I got quite a bit of enjoyment out of it. However, since then, it got temporarily discontinued and prices spiked on the used market, and then eventually Teenage Engineering put out the follow-up, the OP1 Field, which has a lot of improvements on the original, and if you can get one for under $1,000, either a Field or an original, I'd say it's maybe worth it, depending on what you want. You should definitely know exactly what you're getting into first, but for anything more than that, you are much better served, in my opinion, for getting anything else. I think you'll get a lot more value for your money with something other than an OP1 if it's over $1,000. And finally, a word of warning if you choose to get into Grooveboxes. This is a rabbit hole that can be as deep or as shallow as you want it to be. Music production gadgets and hardware in general can be a huge money pit if you're not careful. So take it from me, who has tried a lot of Grooveboxes. You really only need one or two, maybe three if you're really feeling fancy. That should give you plenty of both fun and features to keep you busy and to keep you producing. People like me, who have a ton of them back there, are outliers. I am a content goblin who needs fuel in order to make videos, and that comes in the form of music production gear. If one day I choose to hang up this whole YouTube thing, I would sell most of that gear back there and just keep 2 or 3 of my favorites and make as much music as I want with just that. I would tailor my selections to avoid duplicating duplicating functionality, so I would still get the fun spark of variety, but that would be all I actually need. And of course, if you can't currently afford to get into Grooveboxes, free software and plugins will get you surprisingly far, and actually will probably get you more polished results than you'll get on a Groovebox. The other major thing to keep in mind is that while a lot of the stuff I recommended on this list is very beginner friendly, the Groovebox niche as a whole, at least online, tends to be dominated by music production hardware nerds with a lot of terminology flying around. If you'd like to see me do my best to demystify a bunch of that terminology, I've got you covered in this video up over here, and if you'd like that mega playlist of a much deeper dive into a bunch of the stuff I talked about today, I've got you covered up over here. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.